I think we're going to go ahead and get started in the essence of time. Good evening, everyone. My name is Emily Kalashevsky. I'm the Member Programs Manager here at the League, and I am thrilled to welcome you back for part 2 of our newly elected officials workshop. So last week we saw you and went over including roles and responsibilities. We touched on the Freedom of Information Act, and we talked about municipal finance. Tonight, we will be covering the Open Meetings Act. We'll have a breakout exercise with some special guests and a panel with said special guests, so you can hear experiences that elected officials throughout the state have had in their tenure, so they can share a bit of wisdom with you. So I'm going to introduce them now. So they're going to be leading the breakout exercises, as I referenced just a moment ago. We have Janet Dillon from Saline, Dennis Hennon from Berkeley, and Kathy Winchesky from Bloomington. So you will get to meet them and interact with them a little bit later. We are so thrilled to have them here with us today to help share their knowledge and build some relationships with all of you. I think I referenced this at the beginning of our session last week as well, that our communications team loves to post about the things that our members are doing. So if you feel so inclined, please take a selfie of yourself at your workstation and send it on into NEO, N-E-O, that stands for Newly Elected Official, at mml.org, and you might find yourself featured on social media channels. You can also tweet that and tag us at the League, or find us on Facebook under Michigan Municipal League. And I think I also referenced this last week, but we've got more folks who are joining us from League staff. I'm going to make sure that we give a special shout out. So just like last week, Chris Johnson, who's our general counsel, he's going to be presenting to you tonight. But in addition to that, we have some other staff and team members here. We've got Beth, we've got Sarah, we've got Jessica, we have Charles from the Inquiry Service, and Heather Elliott from the Member Programs team joining us and participating tonight. We are thrilled to welcome you. One thing before we really kick this off is that all of the presentations that you've seen, the handouts, we will be making sure that you have copies of those. We'll send them out via email. So you will get copies of everything you've seen here, so you can reference back to those. With that, I'd like to get into our first topic for the evening. We're going to move right into the Open Meetings Act. And I'm going to turn this back over to my esteemed colleague, Chris Johnson, who is going to take us through it. Take it away, Chris.
Okay, and let's see if we can. Somebody else is sharing, so we can stop here. Let's see if I can do this now. All right. Now we're at the point where we're going to do the second and probably more important of the Sunshine Laws. This is the Open Meetings Act. Again, yes, or last week I said to follow the especially the Freedom of Information Act religiously. Well, I really did with the Open Meetings Act. This is something you just don't want to have happen to you. That could be a real problem for you. Let's see. Once again, we're going to go through the policy of the Act, the basic definitions that apply in the Open Meetings Act, when you have to have an open meeting, which is basically all of the time, unless an exception applies. Some of the problems that has been caused by technology and a misunderstanding of what the Open Meetings Act says at the very beginning, the definition. We're also going to talk a little bit about some key decisions from Michigan courts. And finally, the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, which caused some very specific changes to Michigan law. Remember, we got here because of Watergate and the fact that the president had really lost the confidence of the nation and resigned in disgrace. We ended up with the Open Meetings Act as the second part of the Sunshine Laws. And it's really interesting to look at the actual language of the statute. it says, public body means any state or local legislative governing body, including a board, a commission, a committee, or subcommittee. For the first 10, 15 years after this act was passed, too many folks really started keying in on the idea of a quorum versus the fact that you're talking about a committee or subcommittee that had some authority to govern. That really caused a lot of people to get into trouble, and the courts really were having nothing to do with it because a committee or subcommittee is still considered a public body for purposes of the Open Meetings Act. Well, we only had 2 of the 7 people, in the room. Well, but if they've been designated as a subcommittee to look into that particular issue, they were considered a public body under the Act. So the policy of the Act is really straightforward. It's to strengthen the right of all Michigan citizens to know what goes on in the government by requiring the public bodies to conduct nearly all of the business at an open meeting. And once again, as I mentioned with FOIA, the judicial view is very consistent here. Look at some of this language that comes right straight from a court decision, the Court of Appeals. We do not countenance use of strained legalisms or evasions to undermine the intent of the Open Meetings Act to promote open and responsible government. They are really hammering that community that tried to get around the Open Meetings Act, and the court was going to have nothing to do with it. There's very, very few times where a court is going to be sympathetic to closing the meeting if they don't have one of the specific reasons to do so. So your basic requirements of the Open Meetings Act are, unless there's a specific statutory exception, all meetings of the public body shall be open to the public. And without any doubt, all decisions of a public body shall be made in a meeting open to the public. So you can go into closed session to discuss and deliberate various items if it's allowed for under the statute, but you have to make all of your decisions in public. That means no voting in the closed session. And deliberations of a public body have to be done in public unless you have one of those very specific reasons for going into a closed session. So the Open Meetings Act applies if you're a public body, and again, it includes committees and subcommittees, and that can be in groups smaller than a quorum, and it's still considered to be a public body under the Open Meetings Act. And meets with the quorum present, or even a constructive quorum. There was a case out there that the regents of the University of Michigan broke themselves into small subgroups of like 3 apiece, and then another regent went from room to room to room, and the court considered that to be a constructive quorum. The meeting is called for the purpose of deliberating toward or rendering a decision. Now we'll get to deliberations in just a moment, but that's the important thing. And it's really important to know that in the end, the decision that you're about to be making is effectuating public policy and will require a vote to go into effect. So a very important definition by our court system has been deliberation has been defined to mean any discussion toward a decision. So it can be the act of carefully considering the various issues and options before taking some sort of action. And that's important too. So if you're just narrowing down the options or choosing between the 10 choices you have and get them down to 3 perhaps, if that's done at a subcommittee level, that still has to be done at a public meeting because the subcommittee is charged with whittling down your ultimate choices for the council. And it was very interesting, a fairly recent decision said the actual deliberation isn't necessarily required. It's the fact that the purpose of the meeting was to deliberate toward a decision. So even just calling the meeting for that purpose subjects it to the Open Meetings Act. Again, in some communities, especially early on, they were trying to avoid the quorum and break themselves into little subcommittees. Well, the Michigan courts really saw through that one fairly quickly. And some of the first decisions of the Supreme Court really focused in on the constructive quorum, and that was not going to be allowed to circumvent the requirements of the Open Meetings Act. One of the key things that the courts look to is whether there's been some delegation of authority to the committee or to the subcommittee. And that's important because if the task of that committee or subcommittee is to either develop options or to narrow down the options or to recommend a best option to the council, those are all delegations of authority from the main body, the commission or the council. So what is required by the Open Meetings Act? Well, first, there's got to be notice and there's got to be minutes. At your first regular meeting of the year, and this can be in your fiscal year or in your calendar year, it's your choice. You need to, within 10 days of that, publish your calendar for the year. However, if you make a change in that schedule, you're required within 3 days to post a notice on that change. It's also important to note that if you have a website, you must post these notices on the website. Most of our communities have them, most of our members have them. However, there are a few of the rural townships that don't have the website, so they're not required to post it. But if you have the website, post it on the website. Special meetings and regularly scheduled meetings require an 18-hour notice. Now, this is very important as well. I've been in front of circuit court judges that, are screaming at me because my client couldn't count to 18. They tried to circumvent and play a little bit cute. And, oh, yeah, we did it. Well, when they actually found out when the notice was posted, the plaintiffs in those cases would go to court saying they didn't have a valid meeting, and usually the court would toss out what the council did in that circumstance. So just make sure you do it 18 hours in advance. Now, you also need to keep track of what happened at the meeting by way of minutes. And what's required by the statute are the following. You need the date of the meeting, time of the meeting, place of the meeting. So if it was at Village Hall, you have to list that in the minutes. The members that are present, as well as the members that are absent, any decisions that are made, and if you're going into a closed session, the purpose for which the closed session is called. A roll call vote is taken at any point in the meeting. That has to be in the minutes. And general law villages are required to post a synopsis of the meeting in 3 locations at a minimum. That's what a set of minutes is. As I mentioned before, a set of minutes is not a court transcript. The court transcript captures everything that's said at the meeting, and you do not need to keep a court transcript of your meeting. So you can actually end a lot of the discussion that goes on in the meeting about, I said this, he said that, she said this, she said that, and fight about what's in the minutes because somebody's misremembering what actually occurred in the minutes or meeting, and they're trying to quote, correct the minutes. If it just has the motion that's made, the supporter of the motion, or the seconder of the motion, and then the vote on that, that's sufficient to have the matter go forward. Now, another part of the Open Meetings Act that's really important is you have to allow public comment. Citizens do have the right to address the meeting, and they have the right to record or videotape it in whatever format they want. The city or village may establish reasonable rules for that. So, for example, you can decide that if you're going to record the meeting, that's done from this location in the council chambers, as opposed to a camera right in somebody's face, because the TV news wants to get it on the 5 o'clock news, first thing in the morning. So you can set reasonable rules for how to address the meeting and reasonable rules on recording the meeting. Second issue that's very important right in the Open Meetings Act is that a person can only be removed from the meeting due to a breach of the peace committed at that meeting. So let's say, for example, Chris Johnson becomes an absolute idiot at the meeting. I start hollering, doing crazy stuff, and totally disrupting the meeting. The mayor or presiding officer has the opportunity to ask the chief of police to, escort me out the door. So when I show up to the next meeting, you're all going to be braced for, another tirade, but you can't throw that person out, me, for example, just because I was crazy at the last meeting. I have to do it again at that meeting, and then I could be removed from the meeting again. Many times there's some very disruptive people out there, and many times a governmental entity gets so frustrated and asks their city or village attorney to go get an injunction from having a person actually prevented from coming to a public meeting. Since 1977, I am unaware of a single circuit court judge ever issuing such an injunction. It just doesn't happen because the statute is very, very well laid out, and it's very specific that that person can keep coming into a meeting and it can stay until the person's being disruptive again. Now, the governing body may limit citizens' comment to a specific portion of the agenda. So that's you can do it at the beginning of the meeting, you can do it during the meeting, you can do it after the meeting. I'm going to give you a little bit of political advice here. And remember, I have 40 years of actual experience in that respect. If you put public comment at the end of the meeting, after you've made all your decisions, you're going to have a very angry audience. You're going to have very angry citizens that haven't been listened to before you make your decision. So you have a real problem in that you're going to start festering a lot of anger. And guess who may or may not win the next election? If you really want to be seen as listening to the public, as taking their opinion seriously, you shouldn't do it at the end of the meeting after you've already made all your decisions. So usually at the beginning of a meeting or sometime during the meeting, like maybe at the time that particular agenda item comes up, that's the most logical time probably for that. You can restrict the amount of time an individual may speak, but you don't have the ability to decide the total amount of time. So think carefully on your rules of procedure on this one. It might be great to say, oh, we can give people 10 minutes to talk. Well, 10 minutes times 6 people, that's an hour. And, all of a sudden you could stretch into 3 hours of just public comment. And while you cannot restrict the total amount of time, there are a few techniques, and one of which I used a lot while I was mayor. And, you get to that famous meeting and there's 50 people out there, and your first reaction is, uh-oh, what did we do? And usually the people are going to let you know. Well, after about the second or third person that gets up and says, I think A, B, C, and D. Oh, okay, you've heard this now for 3, maybe 4 times straight. So what I used to like to do is to look at Mr. Smith and say, I just want to make sure I understand you. What you're telling the council here is A, B, C, and D. Now do some really active listening and make sure you're quoting him back as exactly the way say, hey, look, who agrees with, Mr. Smith? And you'll be amazed at how many hands will go up, and they're all telling you, yeah, that's what we all think. That's why we're here. We're here to tell you, Mr. Mayor, that's what we're doing here. So be fair, as I mentioned before, as a presiding officer, make sure you ask the opposite. By the way, who disagrees with Mr. Smith? Raise your hand, and you might see 2 or 3 more hands go up, but you've allowed folks to let you know what they're thinking. And that's very important because that's the whole idea of public comment anyway. They're letting you know, as the governing body, what they think as Joe average citizen. And it's amazing that then most of the group does not need to go back up to the microphone and say A, B, C, and D. You saved probably an hour and a half, 2 hours worth of public comment time, even if it was only going to be in 5-minute chunks, because you've actively listened and are considering their very important input. Now let's get a little bit to the closed sessions, which are very important. First, before you go into a closed session, you have to start in an open meeting. There has to be a motion, a second to that motion, and an adoption of the motion to go into closed session. Now, 2 of the 6 items are for discipline, personnel evaluation, etc., of either an official or an employee, where the second area is for collective bargaining. And in those 2 situations, only a majority vote is required. However, the other 4 exceptions require a 2/3 roll call vote. I always recommend to most communities to take a roll call vote on all 6 of the issues. Sometimes you only need a majority, sometimes you need the 2/3 majority. But in any event, it's a good practice to get into. And the roll call vote and the purpose for calling the closed session have to be entered into the minutes of the open meeting. Include the specific section of the act on that motion to go into closed session. If you're going into closed session for more than one reason, list all the reasons why you're going into closed session in the motion itself, and that motion becomes part of the minutes of the open meeting. Now, I'm going to go through the 6 reasons you can go into closed session, and I'm going to handle it in order of the statute itself. But none of these are more important than the other reasons, but I'm just going to handle it for ease of reference by the way that they put it in the Open Meetings Act. So if the named person requests, there may be a chance for that individual to discuss in closed session a dismissal, suspension, or disciplinary action against the named person, or to hear complaints or charges brought against that individual, or for a periodic personnel evaluation of a public officer or employee. I strongly recommend that you get that request in writing. I've seen a number of situations where the person then claims, well, I didn't ask for a closed session, and you end up in a situation where, who said what, when did they say it? If you have it in writing, I've never seen a circuit court judge say, oh, you didn't have permission. Yes, you do. You've got this little piece of paper, and the circuit court judge is going to be a much happier person for that. If during that closed session, however, the person changes their mind, stop, and then go into open session and continue. Sometimes it happens, not very often, but it sometimes happens. As soon as that person says, I want this all out in the open because I think this is going to be a game of court, whatever, I would definitely stop the meeting at that point, the closed session, and then go back in open session. The second reason allowed for closed sessions for strategy and negotiation sessions for a collective bargaining agreement. And here's the other interesting twist on this one. If requested by either negotiating party. So it can be the city itself, the village itself, in close proximity to the actual negotiations taking place, because you can strategize and build a consensus. For example, we really need to get some more flexibility on these work rules if they're in the contract. That's really important, and you may want to do that before you actually are in negotiations. Barring some sort of very strange fiscal disaster, when you still have 4 or 5 years left in the contract, circuit court judges are going to take a very dim view of you going into closed session for this reason, unless you can clearly show that there was some other reason why you had to reopen the contract. The third scenario to go into closed session is to consider the purchase or lease of real property up until the time that the community either gains an option or the lease of that property is obtained. And why is that? Well, rightly or wrongly, and generally wrongly, Joe Edwards Citizen thinks that the government has more money than they ever need. You'll find out as a public official that is not true. However, if you're thinking of relocating City Hall to the corner of Main Street and Elm Street, and that piece of property is owned by someone else, that property demand is going to come in at twice, 3 or 4 times what a regular appraisal would be. So discussing the potential purchase or lease of real property in closed session is very important, and it protects the taxpayer in a very real way. However, that is not for the sale of real property. So if you have real property that's about to be sold, for whatever reason, you need to do all of that discussion in an open meeting. It's only for the purchase or lease of real property. The fourth particular reason to go into closed session is to consult with an attorney regarding trial or settlement strategy regarding specific pending litigation, but only if the open meeting would have a detrimental effect on or financial effect on the community. Let me give you an example. I, in my career, had represented as a community, and there had been some misconduct on the part of a police officer, which was fairly egregious. There's no question about it. So I had written up a fairly detailed memorandum to the council and showed up at the meeting, and they, in their wisdom, decided they wanted to publicly humiliate the chief of police and the particular officer involved. So they wanted to do it in open session. However, I knew that if I opened my mouth in an open meeting, I was going to not only destroy the chances of settling or resolving that case, I was going to increase the amount maybe tenfold, because what I was going to tell the council was really describing an unfortunate situation. So I basically backed up and I turned around and I left, and they were stunned that I wouldn't talk about it. But as their attorney, I just could not, describe to them how bad the conduct of that particular officer had been. And we left it at that. Anytime you're discussing litigation, you're probably always talking about a detrimental financial effect on the case. So going into closed session to meet with that attorney and discuss whether you should settle or not, and what your trial strategy may or may not be, is very important to take care of. The fifth reason to go into closed session is to consider and review applications for employment if the candidate requests that the application remain confidential. And they all do now. And again, the reason is quite obvious. There are a few communities out there that, if you're even thinking about looking for a better job or more, maybe you're an assistant city manager somewhere and you want to become a city manager somewhere else, there's some communities that would fire you on the spot just for thinking about leaving, which is kind of counterproductive. But in order order to get the best field of candidates, generally allowing them to have confidentiality, at least while the application stage is being made, is important. However, once you decide on some interviews with that candidate and you're interviewing, usually this is even for like the city attorney, the village attorney, or the manager position. In that situation, the actual interviews have to be conducted at a public meeting, and then obviously the applications themselves of those individuals that are interviewed become disclosable as well. And finally, this is one of the more important items in the reasons to go into closed session, is to consider material that's exempt from discussion or disclosure by either a state or federal statute. For example, FOIA itself has a few things in there, such as the operational plans of the police department on handling various items. And if you needed to discuss that, you can go into closed session to discuss how the police department would handle, say, an act of bank robbery in the city. There might be a situation where you are looking at, again, reviewing the appraisal of a piece of property, and it will fall under this one, as well as you're about to try and obtain a public lease of personal property. An example, again, might be a written opinion from your municipal attorney, and due to the attorney-client privilege of the Freedom of Information Act, you can go into closed session to discuss that opinion with each other and with the attorney involved with that. Now, again, it's very important that you remain on topic with what that opinion is. You shouldn't stray into items like, let's amend the budget, or, let's do this, or, well, let's do that. It's easy to, be very conversational and fall into that kind of a trap. But don't allow that to happen to yourself. Make sure that folks stay on topic. That's the reason for the closed session, and stick to it. And when you're done discussing that, leave the closed session. Again, an appraisal, maybe for sale of property, might be appropriate to go into a closed session. But that's it. Just discuss what the appraisal is. Don't go anything further. And finally, again, as I mentioned before, security plans might be exempt in FOIA. So you can go into closed session to discuss those security plans in order to prevent the bad guys from finding out your police department will respond in certain situations. Now, this requires a separate set of minutes to be taken of every closed session. Again, all those things that I talked about before, which are in the set of minutes, also apply to minutes that are taken at the closed session. It's a separate set of minutes. And again, the clerk or designated secretary of the board takes those minutes. And the minutes may only be disclosed if required by a court order, even in a civil action, even if the person requesting the closed session waives or withdraws the request. Those minutes are exempt under the Freedom of Information Act as well. The public body may also go into closed session to discuss the minutes of the closed session. Again, if you have that having the court transcript rather than just a real set of minutes, you might end up going into closed session to argue about who said what. Again, it's not a set of minutes. A set of minutes is all those items that I talked about earlier, and that you'll have a copy of the slide to go with it. Then the minutes may be destroyed 1 year and 1 day after they're approved at a regular meeting in which the closed session minutes were approved. And again, I don't like keeping anything around that could be lawfully and legally discarded. Destroy them after a year and a day after their approval. Again, closed sessions are confidential. What happens in closed session stays in closed session. We have an Attorney General's opinion out there that says a member of the public who discloses the session minutes, closed session minutes, to the public risks criminal prosecution and civil penalties under the Open Meetings Act. And quite frankly, can this be extended to disclosing what the subject matter and the various discussions that were held in closed session? Well, my friend Dave owns that piece of property at Main and Elm. So we'll let Dave know that we think it's worth at least $30,000. And now he knows that we've got at least $30,000 in the pocket. So it's not going to be $60,000. And what you've done to disclose that information to Dave has just cost your taxpayers a boatload of money. And that's the whole reason for the confidentiality of that sort of a situation. So the AG was only asked about the minutes in that situation, but most municipal attorneys will advise you that none of the discussion should ever be disclosed outside of the closed session. Even if you, whether you have ethics ordinances, and many of you do, you may be in violation of that ordinance, rules of your own council rules on a code of conduct might be violated. You might be violating charter provisions. Many charters have that kind of restriction in it. You're definitely violating Robert's Rules of Order if you have adopted Robert's Rules, and you probably violated oath of office. So just don't go there. There's a reason for the closed session. The reason is in the statute. Make sure that you do not disclose what happened at those meetings. So now we get to the technology issue, and I always call this the OMA versus the iPhone. Remember, this act was passed in 1976. Technology's come a long way in that meantime. And this slide, I kind of liken all these people looking at you. That's our legislature. And there's this horrible crash, and they're standing around watching it with kind of a little bit of amusement. The legislature has still not taken into account or discussed any of the new technology that we have. As I mentioned before, when we were talking about FOIA, this stuff was science fiction in 1976. There was no such thing as a smartphone. There was no such thing as a laptop computer. Computers in those days, 1976, used to take up rooms full of stuff as opposed to just, hold it in your hand. That was Dick Tracy, two-way TV wrist radio, which was just science fiction at the time. So you have to understand that deliberating can be done electronically. And let me give you an example here. Both emails and texting can be a violation of the Open Meetings Act. Let's say we have a city council member who comes up with a great idea. That city council member shares the idea with the entire city council via an email. Then all of the other members of the council start replying via the reply all feature of the email system. And why does that happen? Because in business, we've been training ourselves to hit reply all so that everybody knows how everybody else is thinking. But do you see what the problem is here? And social media itself can cause and fall into that kind of category. Let's say we have council member number one of a 5-person council takes to her Facebook page to champion a great new idea. Assume the idea does relate to the role as a council member. Maybe you want to propose a new park in a particular location. Council member 2 does not like this great new idea and replies with a post of her own. 2 days later, council council member 3 agrees with council member 1 and posts a reply on the social media page. Do you see the problem? Even though it might be a little more open than an email, you still have deliberation going on between members of the public body. And what happens here is that both of these examples, none of the procedural requirements of the Open Meetings Act are followed. And they're required to be followed in order to follow the Open Meetings Act. You have to provide notice. You have to provide the opportunity for the public to comment. You have to listen to that comment whether you like it or not, unless they're physically screaming at you and you can't understand what they're saying anyway. So follow the requirements of the Open Meetings Act religiously and don't get falling into that trap of technology. And what happens if there's a violation of the Open Meetings Act? Well, the first thing is the action itself may be invalidated by a circuit court. The Attorney General, a county prosecutor, or any person, including, by the way, media, may bring a civil action in the circuit court to challenge the validity of the action taken by the public body. So if you didn't post notice, whatever you did at that meeting is thrown out on its head. And again, as the Attorney General's already stated, I noted it before, public official who disseminates closed session minutes risk criminal and civil penalties. The Open Meetings Act, unlike the Freedom of Information Act, also provides for criminal misdemeanor penalties against any public official who intentionally violates the act. It could be 90 days in jail and $1,000 for the first offense, and up to a year and $2,000 for second and subsequent violations of the Open Meetings Act. The Freedom of Information Act does not have that kind of penalty in it. And if you weren't aware of it, our current Attorney General actually said, if our office becomes aware of flagrant violations of the Open Meetings Act, we'll be happy to get in, investigate, and somebody can potentially be going to jail. Since 1976, when this act was passed, we've never had an Attorney General that's been that straightforward saying, I'm going to come get you if you violate the Open Meetings Act. I think this is a real sea change. Now, I want to discuss just a little moment here the COVID-19 pandemic. It resulted in some executive orders by the governor, and there were many lawsuits that covered the scope of the governor's order or authority to issue those orders. The Michigan Supreme Court issued two very important decisions with respect to the governor's power during the emergency. Those two acts that the governor was acting under were the Emergency Powers of the Governor Act, which had been adopted in 1946, and the Emergency Management Act that had been adopted in 1976. The Michigan Supreme Court ruled that the 1976 Emergency Management Act requires the governor to receive the consent of the legislature to extend any emergency beyond 28 days. That's a bright red letter requirement in the Emergency Management Act that the court upheld and said the governor can't go beyond that date. And finally, the court ruled that the 1946 Emergency Powers of the Governors Act was unconstitutional because it gave too much of a delegation of legislative powers to the executive, or in this case, the governor. So actually, the Supreme Court threw that section of the law out. Remember last week I was telling you about how court cases also impact how we operate local government? Well, this was a classic situation. And what happened next was the legislature did go out and pass 2020's Public Act 228, and it's been amended a couple of times since. That was the act that allowed local governments to meet in virtual space rather than in physical space. However, all locally declared emergencies were allowed until December 31, 2021, which means starting January 1 of this year, no one could meet virtually. In fact, the rules are such that while a council member can actually attend via Zoom or some other platform, that person does not count for a quorum, and that person cannot vote on a particular issue. It's just like being a regular citizen, just watching to see what's happening. Which finally brings to your attention my first rule of public service, which is the Open Meetings Act has some very serious consequences, and it's not fun if you're sitting in jail. Quite frankly, none of you ran to violate the Open Meetings Act, either intentionally or unintentionally. You don't want to end up facing a criminal misdemeanor charge because of your behavior toward the Open Meetings Act. Just don't do it. Follow the requirements of the Open Meetings Act religiously, and you will stay out of trouble. We have a lot of resources under the Open Meetings Act. Our one-pager plus fact sheets are available on our website. As I mentioned before, there's an excellent treatise on sunshine laws and Michigan municipal law, especially Chapter 5, which is published by the Institute for Continuing Legal Education. And finally, there's a handbook that the Attorney General has out there, where she makes a handbook available to you as well. So resources materials are available to you. And at this point, I will see if there's any questions that folks might have.
Right, let's give it a second and see if got any questions that have come in. There was a question in the chat from earlier. Fee price, would it be okay to have time at the beginning and at the end?
Yes, you can have public comment at both times or all three times, as I mentioned, because you can still do it at the time during the meeting too. So sometimes I've seen a number of councils do it where if you're going to address a topic that's on the agenda, you do it at the beginning of the meeting. If you want to talk about something that's not on the agenda at that time, sometimes they do it at the end of the meeting. So it's a choice by the council itself under your rules of operation. And you'll have to unmute.
Yeah, there it is. Related to the time that people can talk and make their personal comments, it is legal to limit it to 2 minutes or 5 minutes or per individual?
Yes, you may do that. And the other thing is, you don't get to yield your time. That's not a parliamentary issue. I'm going to give my 3 minutes to Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith gets 3 minutes. If that's the rule. Your rule is 2 minutes, you get 2 minutes. Quite frankly, I found that those communities that allow 5 minutes usually get the same thing over and over again in that 5 minutes, because there are very few subjects that really require a full 5 minutes of discussion from one person.
Thank you.
I have a hand up for Wilbur.
Yes, sorry if this was covered earlier. I was a little late to the meeting today. Regarding public comments, can you require that members of the public disclose like their local address or anything like that? Oftentimes I've seen it in school meetings. I know there was a contentious meeting in the UP and I zoomed into where members of the public were wanting to withhold where the county they were from when they were speaking at a specific township. So
The Open Meetings Act specifically allows an individual who not to disclose where they're from. You can't require it. I always found, again, I did this for 28 years. Usually when I'd say something like, "Hi, welcome. Can you state your name and your address?" People, 99 times out of 100 would just say, "Yeah, I live at 123 East Main Street." And that's, if you say it in a friendly fashion, or you request the information in a friendly fashion, people usually give it to you. Again, if you're running a good meeting, that sort of thing just becomes second nature. But you can't require it.
Thank you.
Elizabeth, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I'm wondering, so if you have a situation where, you have, let's say, 10 people speaking at, or, during public comment at the board meeting, and, can the board director, or the president, whatever, say, "No, I'm only listening to one comment on this topic," period.
No, you can't do that.
Okay, thank you.
I think April 6th. Hi, thank you. I'm a mental health counselor as well as a village counselor. So I have some client files in my iPhone that are protected by HIPAA. So if my iPhone were FOIA, one of the issues you mentioned that could come up earlier, would there be measures taken to protect client files and apps?
I would certainly request that the court, if they wanting your agreement, that, a special person be set aside to review files that are city related, village related versus your own personal files, or in that case, your other client files that are protected under FOIA, because any counseling records are exempt of the Freedom of Information Act. The warning that I have is, please be careful about only doing village or city business on your own personal devices. If you can get a device from the community, that's even better. If they issue iPads, for example, and a lot of communities are doing that now because the cost has come down so significantly. And so much of the materials are electronic, in electronic form as it is. It's just easier to use the city or village's device. If you do all your email transactions through the email system that the city or the village has, they'll never have to bother with your own personal device, because in that case, the FOIA coordinator can go right to the email system and pull out all the particular emails that were sent to and from you. So they'll never get to your personal device. The message there is, it's the message and the content of the message versus where the message is stored. So
Thank you.
that's the kind of the warning I was getting. Let's see. Any other hands? Yes. Sally? Yeah.
Muted.
Still, oh,
Can you hear me now?
now I can, yes.
Okay. In the slide that talked about remote work, or sorry, not remote work, remote access for a meeting that existed during the pandemic, it said stay up to date with your attorneys. Does that imply that there's been an effort from any lobbying groups or at the state level to try and expand that beyond kind of that time frame in which it existed?
Yes, quite frankly, the Michigan Municipal League is actively involved in trying to allow for virtual meetings again. But we haven't been successful, by the way. So we're gonna keep trying, because I'll just go back to my community itself, city of Northville, down in the Detroit, Oakland area. We found, hundreds of people were coming to the meetings instead of 10 or 20. And it was just really opening things up to people as opposed to the opposite of what was going on. So we as an organization think that opening the ability to have virtual meetings again would be really important.
Wonderful, thank you.
I don't see any other hands up.
I don't either, so I think we're gonna go ahead and move on to our breakout activity. So I think this again is back to sharing screen here. So basically what's gonna happen this next few minutes, we are going to place you all in breakout rooms that are going to be moderated by those panelists I introduced earlier. So Janet Glenn, Vince Hedden, or Kathy Wachowski. I think Chris Johnson's going to be in one breakout too, just so we can keep the rooms to a manageable size. And we're going to present to you a handful of different scenarios that are absolutely perfect. And you going to discuss your breakout rooms, what do you think the outcome of those scenarios is. We won't give you the answer for the breakout room. We'll just use some time to discuss amongst yourselves, and we'll bring back to the demonstration one. And Chris Johnson will walk us through some of my scenario. So you'll have 2 minutes, maybe 1 less those breakout rooms, talk through as many scenarios as possible on our list. And again, you'll be pulled into the general session room. At the end, we'll go through each one individually, say the answer. So with that, I'm going to allow this team to place us in their rooms. Hi, everyone. Happy. Family. Are you going to try and share your screen, or do you want me to share mine today? I'm going to try it. Okay, see if I can get it. Let's see what happens. All right. You did it. Yeah. Okay, good. Thanks. I'm in a learning curve here with sharing the screen, so thanks for putting up. I'm Kathy Wachowski. I'm the City Councilor, Second Ward City Councilor from the City of Wilmington. And so I'm going to lead us through the breakout session based on areas here. So, and please feel free to give your opinion. Chris is going to go over these at the end. I have found, being an elected official, that FOIA and the OMA rules are very, very confusing at the beginning when you're just starting. So I'm going to say there's no way to these answers. Let's just see if we can get this done. So number 1, in a city council chamber, the video camera is not in the United States, and it records on conversations among the city staff after the council meeting has ended. A copy was sought under FOIA. Is the videotape subject to FOIA? Anybody have an opinion what they think?
How do I unmute?
And you can just unmute and just give it.
Hi there, Central. Can you hear Central Lake? Here we are. We're the village of Central Lake. Hi. And we say, yes, it's FOIAble, because if you can't think of a good reason why it's not FOIAble, then it's FOIAble. That's what we think.
Thank you, Central Lake. April?
Was that right?
We actually had a study where we had turned on and started recording when we were able to be virtually still during the pandemic. And because of the time stations that were maybe not very nice, some people were asked to put down on the board. So it's maybe meeting being what they are some of this stuff.
Yeah, interesting scenario happened there. Yeah. And so, yeah, anybody else have? Yeah.
Generally, I would think yes, but it would be pretty small, though. Raise or challenge the capacity at which the conversation is occurring in. So if it were vulnerability matters or something that you need to the capacity of your public office, then you would way that you're doing it. But if it's a private, and both parties are talking about the capacity, potentially the principal.
Okay, good. We've got a good response on all avenues on that one. We'll see what Chris comes up with on it too. Let's look at number 2. A township board member makes handwritten notes for his personal use and does not circulate them among the other board members. They are not used in the creation of the minutes, and they are retained or destroyed at his sole discretion. Are these notes subject to FOIA?
I'm still
I believe.
if is this under the assumption that they were not destroyed prior to the receipt of FOIA?
I would say probably, he hasn't, they're not destroyed, otherwise the FOIA, no one could get them.
Yeah, no, it would be important.
Okay, you think it'd be FOIA? Okay, anybody else got an opinion?
Yeah, I'm tracking, as mental health counselor, we have progress notes that we, keep for some years, but we also have tracking notes just to kind of keep us, personal just memories, it's in to be made that it's not an intent to, towards deliberations so much as to just kind of keep track of the conversation and to wait for the problem to address something.
So you think those would not be FOIA?
Oh, I think it's arguable.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other opinions?
I don't think it'd be inflictable if they're your personal notes and they're not used in any way, shape, or form to make argument or inform or uninform anyone else on the board. They're your personal notes to keep you in remembrance of what was being discussed. I personally, if I take a pen and a pencil and I'll write down things as we're going along, so I have those things to question in the agenda items or the minutes, so that I know, I had a question about it, and then I can, seek the answer to it. But I'm not using any of my notes to influence anyone else. So I really my personal things, and they're not for them.
Okay, David, so you're going on the stance that because it's personal notes, you're just taking notes for yourself to remember and stuff, that they're not. It sounds like April thought it might be medical, but maybe it could be. And is that Sally? Solid. Okay. And he's got a good comment too that not sure, but it might be. I love those answers because oftentimes that's what he says to us too. I'm not sure, but it might be. Holy moly, we have 52 seconds. Okay, well, let's see what the next question goes up as. An individual council member would like to request documents from the city or village. Should he or she file a FOIA request? So you're a council member and you'd like to request documents from the city. All of FOIA, do you think, or could we just go in and ask for information? Scott, you got any idea?
Yeah, I believe, we can go ahead and certainly request documents. We shouldn't have to, FOIA a document. It's to help us make the decision, to get the proper document. So I don't believe we have to FOIA every document. It's many times, but, it'd be a difficult situation for the city managers.
Boom.
Well, I think, how many you got for me, experience?
Yeah, that's same for us in our breakout room, Chris. Why don't you go ahead and share the answers?
All right, Jessica, do you want to put up up with the answers now? Okay, the first scenario involved the camera that was left on. According to the Court of Appeals, the answer is no. The unedited tape was not a public record since no official city business was conducted during the time that particular video recording was made. The fact that the city had retained the tape did not affect the court's decision in that, just because that was not an official function, and all they did was overhear some staff members talking as opposed to actually conducting city business. Our second was the personal notes being taken by a township board member. In this particular case, the Court of Appeals ruled that the personal notes of the individual board member were not subject to FOIA because that board member was not in charge of doing official minutes. I would note that there was a comment in it as well that the clerk of the township board is charged with the official recording of the minutes. So if the clerk had been taking those notes, those might be considered a FOIA-able document. But this particular person, Hopkins, or the Duncan Township matter, they were not held to be a FOIA request that was subject to the FOIA. The third scenario, an individual council member would like to request documents from the city or village. Should he or she file a FOIA request? When I was talking about responsibilities, I was saying to you earlier, if it's important to one council member, one member of the board, it's probably important to everybody. And I think in those scenarios, you're best off, getting the whole council all of that information so that everybody's working from the same place. Every once in a while, you do have a person that just wants every document that the city's ever had, whether they should have it or not. And those are situations where they may, as a matter of city rules, a procedure, decide that, yeah, you have to file a FOIA request. But having everybody get the same information is really important so that you're all coming from the same place. And so that you all have that same basic knowledge. Other than the FOIA fee, if one member gets the information, everybody should get it. And clearly original documents, again, need to be protected. And any inspection of those documents has to be supervised by the clerk's office. Fourth scenario. The mayor contacts each individual council member to find out his or her position on the city manager before the city manager's status is reviewed at a regularly scheduled council meeting. Would this be considered a meeting? And the answer is no. Actually, I got to argue this case in front of the Court of Appeals myself. And it was interesting because one of the judges we were arguing to was Judge Richard Griffin, and his father was Senator Robert Griffin, who was the House or the Senate minority whip. So that person's job was to count the votes, to call people up and say, hey, how are you going to vote on this issue? So there was no problem with the mayor having one-on-one conversations and say, what do you think about the city manager? And this is the case citation to that particular case. However, the city ended up losing that case because, as it turned out, instead of just knowing how the vote was going to turn out, the mayor showed up at the city manager's office a half hour before the meeting, and all the other council members showed up at the same time. And they had their own little meeting with the city manager in violation of the Open Meetings Act because they hadn't conducted any of the required procedural requirements of the Open Meetings Act. So it was kind of interesting. One on one hand, but lost the war because the council had still gone in and had a meeting with the manager without noticing of it as a public meeting. Next scenario. 3 members of a 7-member park and recreation board are actively exchanging emails as to what should happen in between going at the next meeting's business. The 4th member was included on the 7-member board and was receiving emails but wasn't active in the back and forth. Was this a violation of the Open Meetings Act? And if so, was it by all 5 or all 4 board members? And the answer is yes and yes. They violated the Open Meetings Act because the board was required to deliberate, and 4 people were involved with the email chain, even though the 4th member did not actively participate during the email exchange. During the actual meeting itself, that 4th member voted the same way that the other 3 were going to do. So the circuit court judge undid their actions and required them to do it out in the public meeting rather than in a private meeting. Our next scenario?
I have a question on that one.
Sure.
Jess.
Yeah, does BCC, is it the same thing as somebody speaking multiple people are in
Anybody that's involved with the email, either a CC or BCC, is in the same problem. It's essentially the problem with deliberating electronically, as I mentioned before. You just haven't followed the procedural requirements of the Open Meetings Act. The next scenario is the mayor would like to schedule study sessions for the council. And these meetings, quote, no decisions, end quote, are going to be made. They'll be decided at the next regular meeting. But they're definitely making comments about this option or the other option. Are those study sessions subject to the Open Meetings Act, and does the public have the right to comment? The answer is yes and yes. They may not be making any final decisions, but when you're deliberating towards a decision, that becomes the problem with the definition of deliberating. Especially if the council tends to rubber stamp the proposals from the study session, you're in a real situation where you're violating the Open Meetings Act. You don't conduct that study session in public. Finally, the public does have the opportunity to comment, and maybe even at the end of the study session, but they should be allowed the chance to comment. And our final scenario.
Scenarios that we have, Chris.
Oh, okay. Very good. Any questions on any of those?
We have breakout sessions and there is the first question that is listed.
if somebody is got their ear to the door, and trying to hear what's going on, that becomes a security issue for the community. So, it might be important to station a police officer if you got really thin walls or really thin doors, out in front of that, so that people don't overhear what's going on. But there's no difference between, a situation if the council or the commission or board is allowed to have a closed session, nobody else should be in there except for the people that the city has invited in. Maybe they want their attorney to discuss the attorney-client privilege document. Maybe they want the police chief to discuss the security plan for the water works. It's up to the council to see who they want to have in the meeting or not. Any other question? Mayor Snyder, it's good to see that you have a new job.
Right, well, if there aren't any further questions, we are just gonna take a quick break before we get back together for a panel discussion with veteran elected officials. So let's plan to be back here at 7:25. We'll see you then.
But, hoping that, basically kind of. Great.
But there are ways that you can accidentally violate solar. And so it's just always being aware of what,
Yeah, and we were the kind of conversation. A lot of and way. Using the intent so as that.
yeah. Mhm. Yeah, but I think the email thing. Like, just being aware of how many people are in an email.
Yeah.
For example, we'll get informational emails, but we don't reply. It's just heads up, you should know something, and so we don't reply and say, we get okay, information, so. It's
Yeah.
I think about how much courses. With these kind of cases. One thing I have to see that you, especially with FOIA, is that private, like, for example, anti-union companies or pro-union companies can FOIA huge amounts of data to try to do whatever for collective bargaining. And I think FOIA becomes extended beyond the individual voter and now it includes like corporations can FOIA things. Every now and then I'll get an email from my retirement pension people saying, just so you know, the Florida Center for Retirement Freedom has FOIA'd all names and addresses of members, stuff like that. So it just, that seems to be beyond the intent of the law, so.
Yeah.
I didn't know there were candy bars over here.
Okay.
Okay. Just nice and light.
It's very informational. But it still can get confusing.
It kind of makes you, you think of the need for more public, public, engagement in helping run the government, helping to, do what we're doing. But this could scare them away.
Yeah.
Sure. Mhm.
All right, what a lovely break. We're gonna start welcoming folks back. So I'll wait to see a few more faces on screens. It's not a requirement that you keep your camera on, although it does let us do start back up again with us. Give it just a minute. All right, so this final session of really elected official training is really a delight because we invite some veteran elected officials to join us to talk a little bit about their experience as elected officials. And share a bit of wisdom, maybe some things they wish they would have known earlier on in their careers. So I'm thrilled to welcome panelists for this evening. We have Janet Dillon, she's a council member for the city of Saline, Dennis Hennon, a council member for the city of Berkeley, and Kathy Winchesky, a councilor in the city of Bloomington. So actually, I am going to ask each of them, instead of reading bios, to briefly introduce themselves and talk a bit about their path to elected office. And just for the sake of picking an order, I'm going to go with Janet, alphabetical, of course. So Janet, please introduce yourself to our group today and tell us a little bit about how you hold yourself as an elected official.
Thank you. As I mentioned, my name is Janet Dillon. I am in my 5th term as a city council member for the city of Saline. So those that are not local to this area of Michigan, we are just right outside of Ann Arbor. We're sort of a little sister in area. I got involved in city politics. It was definitely not something I was looking to do by any means. And to be honest, our community has a leadership program. I have done that. And I always say that the best way to get people involved is to ask them. And someone asked me, would you consider running for school? I said, no, I don't really think that's my thing. I said, well, what about city council? And I thought, well, that could be a good fit, and sort of, I've always been very involved in my community, and I thought, this would be the next big step to. And it was definitely for me. The good thing for me was that I had a to law firms for many years, and so I love policy, I love procedures, so it was sort of a good fit right from the start with that. Emily, do you want me to continue on, or were you going to ask more questions? Do you sort of want me to keep going through?
Just wanted you to do a quick intro. So we'll get to some questions, and I'll say for newly electeds who are joining us for the training, if you have questions from panelists, you can feel free to raise your hand. Raise the chat to submit questions. We've got some we're going to ask, but in case you have something, we want to make sure you have time as well. So thank you, Janet. I'm going to go ahead and move on to our next panelist, Dennis Hennon from Berkeley.
Yeah, I'm in Berkeley, which is just a little bit north of Detroit. I'm in my second term now. I've been in office for 5 years. My background was mathematics and computer science, but politics always interested me, and helping other people always interested me. I had been involved in some grassroots organizing where I lived previously. And then when I moved here, there were some issues around land use and code enforcement that came up, and I got involved. And saw that the city wasn't as responsive as they could have been. The people on council weren't bad people, but they just really hadn't faced a challenge in over 10 years at the time. And I think they'd become sort of complacent. So I threw my hat in the ring, won an election, and now after serving the full term, I really feel like the city's doing a much better job now of engaging the community.
Thank you, Dennis. And our last panelist, Kathy Winchesky from Ludington.
Hi, I'm Kathy Winchesky. I'm a retired high school chemistry teacher. And so I was not interested in politics at all, but my chemistry was from the mayor. And this was 9 years ago. And he knocked on my door after 12 years from teaching, and he said, no competition for the school board. Would you consider doing this? I said, no. Competition? No, I'm interested in. Well, the third time he knocked on my door, my husband looked at each other and said, this is not a great place to live. It's the fifth generation of my family's here. They really need someone to step in and do it. And I really enjoyed it. I think my experience as a teacher led me to deal very effectively with the city council. As a school teacher, that's a lot of really plus, but I really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Kathy. So I'm going to start with sort of an easy, hopefully, question. This can be for any of the panelists, so feel free to jump in. But what surprised you most upon assuming the role?
Well, I'll start with that. There was no doubt. The city manager took me around the city and showed me different things. Where the water treatment plant was, the sewage treatment plant, the stormwater system, and everything else. I couldn't believe I had lived here for 60 years and I didn't know anything about city government. That was my biggest surprise on the first or second day after I was elected.
Yeah, for me, it was, I decided a year before that I was going to run and started researching, looking into things and educating myself. And still, when you take office, there is still a lot to learn. There's always a lot to learn, always new topics, always new things coming along. And, if you aren't constantly learning, you're just not going to be successful. I'll put in a plug for the MML's Elected Officials Academy that, really gives you a framework for how you need to, get those knowledge and the skills you need to be successful.
And I will tag in with one of the biggest things that was eye-opening to me, it still keeps me in awe, is budgeting. And realizing that there is not an unlimited source of funding, and understanding that it really is a juggling game, and it requires a lot of planning and decisions. People ask, why does it take so long? Well, it does. That's how budgeting works. And there's a planning stage, and then there's studies, and there is there's a lot of places that you have to get to before you actually get to build something. And understanding that that it's definitely not an instant gratification process.
So Dennis, you mentioned the Elected Officials Academy, so I gotta dig in on that a little bit, because spoiler alert, all three of our panelists are actually on our Elected Officials Academy board. Dennis is the vice president, and the others serve on the board as well. Can you talk a little bit, Dennis, about the Elected Officials Academy and maybe the most valuable piece that you gained from your participation?
Oh, gee, the most valuable piece, there's so much value to it. But, it's, like I said, it gives you a framework, gives you, here are some general areas that you need to go in. And sometimes it gets you out of your comfort zone in the places that, all of us have different comfort zones, but it'll get you doing different things, like being a panelist here. Is good and learning, when you're teaching others, you're learning as well. And it's just gives you a framework to build up and learn more. And there's lots of classes, lots of training opportunities, and with those come a lot of networking opportunities. So just getting to talk to other people in other communities gives you ideas on how they're tackling problems and helps you solve a problem in your community.
Again, it's free to participate. Not that I want to harp too much on the Elected Academy. It is a free quality of elected officials, but we want to make sure that you take advantage of if you're interested. So one thing we sometimes have fun when we talk with elected officials, and it's certainly something that we're working in the league, having been recent at a convention, which was just a couple of months ago, is the idea of sort of self-care. And I know that's a buzzword right now, but most elected officials have full-time jobs. And then there are elected officials on top of it, in addition to any family responsibilities, caretaking responsibilities. It can be tough to manage all of it. So I'm curious, and this is a question for any of the panelists, how will you manage all of the work and advice you have for the other officials who are sort of entering this space?
I'm happy to start in, and one of the biggest things that I've learned from being a counselor, and it took me a very long time to find that it's okay to say no. This is not a good time for me. I've learned, because people will stop. I'm in a small community. Everybody knows everybody. I will be at my daughter's band concert. I'll be standing in line at a grocery store. I'll be out to dinner with my husband, and he come up to you and want to talk about something. And in the beginning, I would say, okay, you know what? I would get up and I would have a conversation with them. And it really wasn't, it wasn't fair to my family. It wasn't fair to the others that it was taking me away from them. And so for me, I sort of learned and said, you know what? This isn't the best time for me. And I always have a business card handy. And I said, you can call me or email me. We can absolutely set up time. Can devote some full attention to you and your issue. That was a really important step for me. And I think it really helped me to find a better life balance with council.
Yeah, I'm just going to mention time management just in general. I do sort of the same sort of thing. I'll get people, you've got 15 minutes, and if the conversation goes well, it's going well, I'll give them more. If they're just calling to complain and keep rehashing the same thing, I have our 15 minutes is up, sorry, I have to go. So, but usually people, that's sort of rare. But the other thing I do is having some trusted advisors, both people I can bounce ideas off of, but also people I can vent to. That a lot of things are sometimes very frustrating, and you just you need people to vent, and sometimes your wife gets tired of hearing you too. So surrounding yourself with those people you can really trust is a big help.
Good, and I would reiterate a lot too. I think at the grocery store, that's the most famous place that I get to. It's quick going shopping with me because you can't get out. Most people are, they have something they want to say, and it doesn't take very long to just like we do like something and we'll get over it. We have to get engaged. And most people pretty well get into it. What do we need to my research? So we have to be doing something on this case. We don't to be aligned. We don't be able to people here around the Indian city 120 50 feet. So maybe everybody maybe we're in the video. The research from there. And that's the kind of the thing time. Okay, so we're going to go what to do and spending, always people to work and just saying that's the major suffer is the research. So you have to be careful with that. You have to do it. You have to be able to do it. It's encouraging starting thinking every single newly elected people and then and I think all of them for years participated in the Premier League who so this one she had an arrangement with her husband and he did the grocery shopping so that she didn't even go to the store, which I think was an interesting way to divvy up some of that household work to make it work with the family. So an option if you need it is there. But Dennis, you talked a little bit in your answer about some perhaps your constituents who might call you and they're maybe not happy with something that you've done. You're calling to complain. How is it that you found you handle conflict with a fellow council member? We'll get to that.
Well, it's really hard sometimes, but you gotta keep her cool. You've got to take the upper hand. People, it doesn't matter how poorly you're treated. If you dish it back, and I've been guilty of this, and it's come back to bite me. It looks bad on you, but not the other person. Sometimes it's often social media where this is happening, and so I will engage with the person, but my audience isn't that person. I'm not trying to change their mind. I'm trying to educate and inform everybody that's watching. So, there are some people that are just, they don't like you for some reason, they don't like anyone in government for whatever reason. And, you have to sort of be able to try and identify, give everyone the benefit of the doubt, but some people you eventually learn and you need to keep your distance, you need to, just ignore them, or if they're spreading, really bad misinformation, learn how to engage without engaging, so other people, can get it.
And then Kathy, anything different to add to that?
I guess one thing is respect, you know, I mean, hold yourself to a higher standard, even if they're expecting you so much and you're very angry and everything else. I find that if you hold that, if you listen to what they're saying, actively listen to what they're saying, and to what they just said to you, so they're sure that you heard what they said. So I understand that you're upset because we're doing objectives in the city and you don't think they should be there because of the code. And then when you do that, it kind of diffuses the bottom a little bit. And they go, oh, she really did hear what I was going to say. And we say to them, I'll take it into the committee, I'll take it into the council chambers with me. And I think that listening really, really helps a lot.
I agree, Kathy. One of the greatest things that I learned how to do is just pause. Sometimes you have to let people speak and they just need to vent. And, you know, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, sometimes it's ugly. You just let them get through it and then sort of pause. And then, okay, let's break this down into where your concerns are. And, you know, sometimes just clarifying the information because social media can be the devil with misinformation. Without question, I saw, I read, somebody said, and that becomes toxic at times when there's so much misinformation or people just sort of pile on to it, you know, something. And so just sort of clarifying, okay, just so we're on the same page about this is what you said. This is where I think there may be a bit of a misstatement. Can we go back and talk about this part of it? And sometimes that helps to confuse it. Sometimes there's nothing you can do to console someone. Absolutely, there's nothing I can do to fix the situation. I can listen, and I can try. And I think that's, you know, I think there are times when people just appreciate that aspect of it. I can't fix everything.
Okay, you mentioned social media. I want to touch on that a bit too, and just communicating with community members. What's your relationship like with social media? And whether you do or don't use it, how is it that you are reaching out to community members?
I do use social media quite a bit, and I try to make sure that people know that we're having, you know, meetings are going on, that information is out there. One of the things that I will say that I absolutely adamant about is anytime I post to social media in response to somebody, I always say, I believe, it is my opinion. I want to be very clear that I am not speaking for the council. Even if I'm speaking on my council page, I'm speaking as Janet Dillon, council member, not on behalf of the council body. So that's one of the things I always make sure to do, because it is, you know, there's definitely, you don't want to get into issues with OMA and such, because you get council members that will all chime into an issue. And then all of a sudden you realize, wait a minute, you know what? We are actively having a discussion about the topic. And you don't want to get into those kind of situations. What our community is doing right now is trying to find means beyond social media. Because we're at a time where we just assume everybody is on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or such. And that's not the case in most communities. So we're rolling out some new efforts in the coming year, and so I'm really hoping that's going to better inform our community and help engage our residents.
Yes, and I can add. Oh, we're on the same page. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to echo that. For sure, make sure when you were speaking for yourself, that you make that clear that you're not trying to represent the entire council. Now, if council has taken a vote and has a stand on an issue, then I'm okay saying that, you know, this is what council decided, even if it isn't a unanimous vote. And sometimes they'll say, I'm in the minority, and the majority will say, this is what I will do. But I also don't feel litigating, the loss of it. Once the council has decided, that's the direction, that y'all need to go. Continuing to fight those battles just in the.
Really different view a little bit. I don't do much on social media, and we have a city website, a city Facebook page, where we put out announcements and stuff. But we've done some really successful things. We started a newsletter that went in with our tax bill, so whether we extra page. We did board meeting this summer. Our board had a meeting outside of the phone that if you do offer food, there's a lot more people than if you don't. So we did that. We had a wonderful meeting. We had a community meeting, and we broke up into different teams. We listed all the things that the city staff put out. We've done that meeting. We've done the top 8 volcanoes. We have from the other things. So we're trying to do some of those things. We have writing files and some where anybody can come. It's all free activities. And those things more adding to the emphasis of those.
I can be bribed with food as well. So I think it's fair to say offer some food in your community. It might be a little bit. So thanks for that, Kathy. So I just want to pause for a moment, make sure no one in the audience has any specific questions they want answered, because I've got maybe just 1 or 2 more folks that have joined us. Anyone in the audience, either in the chat or unmute yourself and ask if you can. A burning question. Go ahead, David.
I'm curious, for Janet, in some of the, I guess, kind of non-social media ideas that you guys are kicking around for engaging residents without having to use social media. We do have a website, but it seems that about only residents newsletter from the website. Do that check.
Peter, me there for a second. So we do a couple of different things. Similar to what Kathy mentioned, I believe, is that in our community, we do have a literally newsletter that goes out with our utility bills. But on a different basis, we also have a 411 system. It's a texting system. There's different versions. There's Textly, there's Nextdoor, things like that, which is a great way to push out information. You do not have to have a smartphone to use a lot of texting services. Any phone, it can be a phone, that as long as they can receive a text, that's all that's necessary. And so that's something we're actively working through now. And to be honest, we're actually thinking about going back to good old-fashioned US mail, going out with postcards and mailing them to residents, business owners, so that we're sort of hitting every household on a regular basis. Especially when things like surveys are being done, master planning, strategic planning, that kind of thing that's going on. Just because you want to touch all of those residents and business owners to make sure that they're being heard and that they're part of the process.
Yeah, we have recently, after it was dormant for 10 or more years, brought back a quarterly newsletter that goes out to every address in the city. But it's a balancing act. Getting people on social media and electronically is cheap or free. Getting it, sending those mailings out, it adds up really fast. And so, you have to be, and sometimes you just can't get, and you're doing it once a quarter, you can't afford, or you can't get timely information out there. So, you know, it's probably one of the toughest problems that I still don't have an answer for, you know, after 5 years and probably plus, you know, it's just always a shame.
And I just have to agree with that. I think one of the biggest struggles with that is communication. You know, there are people that still get the newspaper, but they are on the computer. There are people having the computer that don't get the newspaper. We have renters. If we send a newsletter, the tax bill, it goes to the owner, but even the people who are living in rental situations. So I agree, it is a huge problem we need to solve. So we can do all different ways of doing it.
Terry, did you have a question? I see your hand just up. Looks like you're still muted.
Emails. I would like for our village to compile a list of emails. Several of the neighboring townships have done that and been quite successful with their newsletters that way. So, you know, we're in this age where we have people who still don't know how to even email, but we're in a transition period with all this technology of people that know how to use it and don't know. So it's interesting. But how many people do emails? I mean, like, is that a normal thing to do?
We have an email newsletter, and we also will send out urgent things like a water main break and snow emergency, get your cars off the street so we can plow. So yeah, we have a little email, but of course, like you said, it doesn't reach everyone.
Okay, yeah, because most people get it on their wristwatch. So. All right, thank you.
Another thing that we've started doing now is that we've developed really good relationships with our HOAs. And that's been very helpful because HOAs have generally, they have constant contact with the residents in the area. Okay. And it's been a really good experience getting information out to the HOA, and when we're having monthly meetings or just the network of people are able to sort of share the information amongst themselves.
Always learning from one another. All right, well, let's close this out with our panelists offering maybe one final piece of advice, one morsel of wisdom before we set really elected officials and some seasoned ones as well out free to do the good work in their communities. And whoever wants to start, just go ahead.
So I'll be happy to start. Okay, I'm going to give you two different things. First, it's okay to not know everything. Because it can be very overwhelming. And so that's, you know, that's always okay to say, I don't have that information now. And either find the person that has it, do research on your own, that's always fine. The other piece to that I'll say is, whatever your lane is, stay in it. You know, that's with council in our community. We know our role is to make policy. The staff side, they implement the policies that we make. We do not direct staff, we do not direct action. We make the policies and they implement.
I guess too, just looking at how hard it is to be on city council, is do your research, talk to people, take input when a big decision's coming up, like the chicken issue, and then make a decision. You know, make your decision and know how you're going to vote after weeks of research and listening to the committee and people in the community and stuff. Have reasons for why you're going to vote the way you're going to vote, and explain it at the city council meeting. I have decided to vote yes on this because, so everyone knows. And there's a lot of respect that you'll get for that. Whether they agree with you or not, you've given your reasons on why that's happening. And enjoy it. You'll get to meet lots of people, city councilors come and go, city managers come and go, and you'll meet lots of people and enjoy it. It's a lot of fun.
And I just want to go back to the communication part. Know your audience. You're going to learn the jargon. You're just going to know the legal landscape, all the moving pieces that most people don't know, that you don't know probably right now. And so you've got to be able to speak to a level that your audience can understand. Don't use the jargon. I like in writing using just short bullet points, and people pay more attention to it. And I found when you get too far into the weeds, you want a numbers guy and put out lots of numbers, and then people will, either they don't understand it or people will abuse it to try and, twist it to their own needs. So, just being simple, be truthful, but don't try and just don't, keep it simple.
Well, I want to give a huge thank you to Dennis, Janet, Kathy. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your wisdom and your experience with us this evening. So valuable, and a little silent round of applause. I also want to give a huge thanks to the ML team who makes this possible. Jess, Sarah, Beck, Heather, Mary, Chris Johnson, who's been here the whole time. If you see them in person at an upcoming event or you communicate with them, give them a pat on the back. They're doing awesome work, and I know I'm just honored to work with them. So make sure you reach out and say hi and say thanks if you have a moment. We've got a couple of options for you if you are interested in additional training. As we've talked about, we've got the Elected Officials Academy core weekend that is the next step in this training process. So if you're interested, we've got a virtual option coming up in February. It's 10th and 11th. Way up here on Zoom. But if you prefer to see us in person, we will be in Bay City May 19th and 20th. So please mark your calendars. We hope to see you then. I mentioned our Capital Conference that's coming up as well. That's in April. We've got already up on our events calendar and MLOs.org. And as I referenced a couple of times earlier, we'll make sure that we follow up with you so you have copies of these presentations. And we hope you fill out the survey and let us know this training. So with that, I think we have reached the conclusion of the program. It has been great to meet you all, and we can't wait to see you at more league events in the future. Have a great evening and have a lovely holiday season.
Thank you. Thank you to Emily for all you did for us.